Well, good afternoon if you are in New York or Montreal or Palm Beach, Florida. Good evening if you are in Zurich or Berlin or Madrid or any number of interesting places where my guest sings all the time. Greetings to people all around the world. Wishes for peace and understanding and the ability to get past whatever idiocy makes people hate one another. Um, Music is part of what we use to heal, and that's part of why I'm here and my guests are here, especially my friend today, Daniel Okulitch, a Canadian American bass-baritone, who joins me today from Montreal, where he is in rehearsal for a world premiere of an opera. And I just want to say to listeners, I'm pre-recording this program, and he's in rehearsal, but the opera is not opened yet. And this show will be broadcast after the opera has had its run. So we're not going to talk about how the opera is going in performance because it hasn't happened yet, but we will talk about the opera. But in the meantime, Daniel Okulitch, welcome. It's great to see you.
It is great to see you. It has been too long. We have run into each other in person a handful of occasions in New York, and all of the rest of the time it's been through the interwebs. So this is really lovely.
And I've seen you perform in different places.
This is true. This is true. What was the last one that you saw?
I don't know what the last one is. I'm not good in chronology, but I've seen your Don Giovanni. I've seen Enemies, a Love Story, which is something I want to talk about because I was working with Palm Beach Opera and that's where it premiered. And Ben Moore, who wrote it, is a friend of mine. He's been on this program. And so for all those reasons, that was one, but quite a few now that I realize. And when I sometimes, when I do these conversations, I usually ask one question and I don't write other questions. I just take it from there. But in your case, I didn't frame it as a question. I wrote, Daniel Okulitch, bass baritone, seems to go anywhere there is an interesting opportunity.
I like that. I like that.
And by the way, I did not introduce Adagio, which I meant to do. Forgive me. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. Daniel, I was so excited to talk to you that I didn't do my duty. So you seem to go anywhere there's an interesting opportunity. Is that accurate?
I think that's good. I hadn't really thought about that in that way. Yeah, I really lean into and seek out projects that feel different and challenging and it's which isn't to say that I don't obviously do a lot of the standard rep as well, which a lot of that has been in the Mozart realm. But I think early on in my career, I looked at the landscape and so much of what I was drawn to, but also what I thought would get me noticed. Because that's kind of when you're just post young artist, the biggest thing is how are you going to stand out? How are you going to be seen? And I think you have to go towards that which feels most true to you. And I had recently, I at the beginning of my career, I had done the Baz Luhrmann La Boheme on Broadway,
which I saw,
which was very different in it, but I had very little control over that. I was just thrilled to be in New York and be doing work and working with Baz, and it was such a remarkably fun experience. Post that, I started doing auditions, and I believe I was the first one at the time because it had only been out for about a year, doing the big sort of confession scene from Dead Man Walking. This was my audition piece at the time, and it really allowed me to demonstrate a large emotional range and a lot of acting. And so those projects started coming my way, doing premieres at the Bard Festival, ones in Fort Worth, and I
just talked about Fort Worth. At Fort Worth Opera for a long period, though not right now, was a place that was very cutting edge.
I agree.
We don't necessarily think of West Texas as being the place with cutting edge opera, but they really were.
They really were. Darren Woods was doing really exciting new stuff there. I did the Passatieri's new piece, Frau Margot. We did Little Women there. That was my first thing there, of course. We did Dead Man Walking. We did JFK. And
And you played Lyndon Baines Johnson.
I sure did. I sure
Yeah.
did. That was wild. That was. We'll talk about that. I suppose when you say that I go where the interesting work is, I made the calculation early on that being seen would come through doing a lot of new works and doing premieres, and then also maintaining, if you will, your street cred by doing enough of the standard rep and showing that I wasn't only as an acting singer, but a singing actor as well. And so to this day, I have long-standing collaborations with Royce Vavrick, as the librettist, and I get the calls to look into to try out new pieces, workshop them, and I think, as I've said maybe in some other talks, what I really value about it is, for a time, if you're doing a new work, for whatever window of time, you are currently the best in the world doing it, because you're the only one doing it. But as such, no one can look at what you're doing and go, yeah, but I liked it better in the 1942 recording. Mm-hmm. Or, you really get a chance to create from nothing. And that can be so much stress and work, but it's always the most valuable experience for me.
So I'm going to push back a little, not to disagree, but I want to fine tune this a bit.
Yeah.
If you are doing a world premiere of a new opera, and you have a small role or the lead role, it doesn't quite matter, your performance will be judged by the reception of the new work.
Yes, that's a very good point.
Whereas if you're playing Don Giovanni or Schaunard, people know the roles, and then people will say, well, his Don Giovanni was interesting because, and we're not judging Mozart and Da Ponte. Whereas if you're doing a work, as you are right now in Montreal, that we'll talk about, that's a new creation, people go there first, I think, are taking in the creation, even though you're in a great cast, as it happens. But they'll say, well, it's a very good cast, and they put together a good cast for this work, and did those people serve the work?
That's very true. It is part of the challenge, actually, with doing new works is the work is talked about first, and no one can really know unless they're, whether or not you're doing it justice, or whether are you elevating it, or are you dragging it down, or are you somewhere in the middle? Could there be someone better at it? And yet there are times when a performance leaps off the stage in a piece you've never seen. I remember seeing video of Written on Skin, and there was
George Benjamin.
By George Benjamin, which I've done. I did here in in Montreal myself. Yeah. And watching, Barbara Hannigan and Chris Purvis, I didn't care that I'd never heard the music before their performances, because they're such astonishingly good stage animals. I would watch Chris Purvis do anything. He is such an amazing stage actor and singer as well. And so you have the opportunity to go even beyond just the reception of the work. But it is tricky, I think. And most of us who do new works, we read the reviews, and the performers get a few lines of, about their work. Mostly it's talking about the creation of it. And I really always encourage people to see a new work more than once. Please come and see it more than once. My favorite story about that is my parents, who came to see the premiere of Brokeback Mountain in Madrid, which was very challenging music for the performer.
Describe that opera. I know the opera because I actually had to do a lecture before it in the New York City Opera, so I had to learn the opera. But describe it, because yes, there's the novel by Annie Proulx, and there's the famous film, but the opera is different again because of the music.
Absolutely. So Annie Proulx did the libretto as well for the opera. And so the music was by Charles Warren, who passed just the year before last, I believe. And who Pulitzer Prize winning, one could say minimalist, atonal. It's hard to describe his music, but he unfortunately hated the word I'm about to use, but I still find it apt, which was his music was very angular and non-melodic in any discernible way, which isn't a strike against or against anything. But what they tried to achieve in that piece was getting back to the true feeling of the short story, which, as opposed to the film, was very stark and brutal and cold. These were not bucolic areas. These were not beautiful people. Those were compromises they made in the Hollywood version to make
yourself.
Listen, going up against Jake Gyllenhaal and Heath Ledger. But, they didn't make it into a gentle
romance. I mean, it wasn't romance, but it was a romance
but it wasn't romantic
of average people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so Charles's music strove, and the libretto strove to capture that. There was no sentimentality. Maybe that's the best word to use. And as such, I think it was challenging for a lot of people just from a musical standpoint, because the music was coming at you in a very aggressive way at times.
Yep.
I really found it very valuable. I loved that project. But my parents, who have grown in their musical literacy through the years, through their involvement in coming to see me perform, but nonetheless are not studied. They came in the first performance, they went, wow, great job. And then they came again and again. I think they came 3 or 4 times. And they said it was so important for them to hear it more than once, because the first time, I don't know how much of the experience is simply adapting to the tonal world that you're now inhabiting, which you were before unfamiliar with. And that just takes time to figure out, where am I? How is this working? And then to focus on the performances and the surtitles and your emotions, your reactions to it, what you ate for dinner.
It is Madrid.
It is Madrid. Everyone had dinner afterwards anyways, right?
Yeah.
But I just think it takes a lot of time to really allow these to come in. So I almost wish that critics didn't do a review of a new piece after the premiere.
Yeah.
That they saw it again, and maybe a third time before writing the review. Of course, that doesn't serve the opera company who's trying to generate
tickets.
It's tricky. Yeah.
Ennis Del Mar is the character you played. For people who only know the movie, that's the Heath Ledger character, is famously inarticulate.
Mm-hmm.
How does your character, but then you as the performer, express being inarticulate when you're singing and you're supposed to be making an acoustical presence, not just a visual presence?
Charles wrote that in. A lot of my first lines are just, yep, I'm going, just really sort of short and low in the voice and growly. And a lot of the tessitura was middle C and below until a few outbursts later on. But a lot of it was in the delivery. I couldn't sing it in a noble, beautiful way all the time. I couldn't be, I'm sorry, it was, I'm sorry, Alma. Still with enough resonance to make it out into the house. But, singing with an accent can be very cringy in opera if it's not done well. I hope to think that I did it convincingly without it making some crazy drawl. But that was a challenge. What I liked is that, the process for Ennis was he finds his voice by the end when it's too late. He finally gets to the point of being able to express his feelings to himself after Jack has already died. And then he gets these beautiful long lyric lines, and the heartbreak is for himself that he realizes that he never found the strength to say these when it mattered.
Maybe we should, for listeners who might not know the film or the opera, the book, basically, I believe it's set around 1963. It's the story of 2 men in Wyoming who are they cowboys, or they herd sheep? Actually,
they're not even cowboys. They're along lower. They're sheep herders, ranch hands, that sort of thing.
They're hired by a man who owns these sheep to go up to the high plains to where the sheep can graze. And they're both very Western, macho, awkward, missing their women, they think. and then they discover a physical attraction. They discover an emotional, powerful bond, and that in 1963 in their society is just not on. It's verboten, and they have, especially one of them, great trouble dealing with and accepting what he's discovered about himself, and
Mm-hmm.
that's your character.
Mm-hmm.
And the other character is a little more open to it,
Mm-hmm.
and he's murdered eventually. I remember in Mexico, he wants to be with Ennis, but Ennis refuses, and then Jake, that's his name, forgot his name.
Jack is his name.
Jack,
Yep.
played by Jake, um, goes to Mexico to brothels, and he's murdered, I think.
He's not actually murdered in Mexico. We understand that it takes place. He does at some point own up to the fact that he does, and that's actually not in the opera, I don't believe, unless I'm misremembering. But he comments how he yeah, if you he doesn't he can't wait for a time with Ennis once every few years.
Yeah,
He has his needs. He's married, but it's a sham sort of marriage. But that we never fully get confirmation that he was murdered.
okay.
But Ennis has his suspicions.
In the film, that's made more clear.
It is made more clear in that Ennis envisions what happened, because that's what happened to some neighbor, a male couple, or one of the male men living near him as a child, who had a partner, and then his father was the one who beat him to death with a tire iron, that sort of thing. So that's a trauma within Ennis that is what keeps him completely unwilling to ever admit what he is. And he doesn't even really have a word for what he is. The word homosexual or gay that's not him, because he identifies that with someone who is maybe effeminate, or one of the weird ones, and moreover, someone who gets killed. So there's no way he could ever allow himself to identify with that. But what he does identify with by the end, what he said, he realizes who he is a man who loves Jack. That's
Understood.
Yeah.
So here's a question I've never in my life asked an opera singer.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I have indirectly, but I'm going to ask this one directly. If you're playing a role, especially a famous role, in an opera version of something that exists as theater, as novel, as film, let's say Shakespeare, in Greeks and other source material, do you base your performance on what is on the page musically and the libretto, or do you try to draw from, I'm not going to take Ennis, but let's say Don Giovanni or Hamlet, or one of those roles that are so famous that you could draw from a very wide range of influences, or you just stick with the Ponte Mozart, for example?
I will mine ideas from anywhere. And I don't feel strange about, in the case of Brokeback or The Fly or the Willy Wonka one I did, or Dead Man Walking, I feel no weirdness in looking at the performances of other actors who played these roles in different mediums. It's never for the sake of imitation, but there are times when seeing someone else do a scene, which are rarely verbatim, to see what emotional truth they found in the scene. And it's not even that I will imitate that, but it will inspire me to go, okay, they found that he was sad in that moment, or angry, or that his intention was to try and convince her of something. And I can take that and consider it as an option for if there's a parallel scene. There may be physicalities that I'm interested in, how they reflected it. When preparing Don Giovanni, I watched the Heath Ledger Casanova. I watched Don Juan de Mark. Was that it? There's so many. Yeah, there's so many. And or one that I think was most potent was John Malkovich in Dangerous Liaisons. That's just fantastic. Sort of, there's so many things to mine that you can use in a particular moment. The Zerlina moment, there's one from Dangerous Liaisons that I draw on quite regularly. So I love mining for source material, but in the end, the music will tell me and just my interplay with my fellow actors will tell me what I need, where it's going to go. Imitation is unsatisfying.
So I entirely forgot that Heath Ledger did a version of Casanova, because
Yeah,
I know the Fellini version starring Canadian Donald Sutherland because
right.
I was an extra in that movie.
You were not. Amazing. Amazing. What did you do? What was your?
I you have to imagine a younger version of me, slimmer, not that much slimmer, but with a full head of thick black curly hair.
Mhm.
And it was one of the orgy scenes, except that I didn't get the honor or the privilege or the opportunity to be an orgiast because Fellini said, "This boy knows how to eat." So I, I had to eat. I didn't get
Uh,
anyone to orgy with.
what was it like? What was it like to be so seen? To be seen,
Well,
really.
I mean, I was just I was apparently so focused on my food that I didn't notice everything going on around me.
Ah,
And that was part of, I mean, Fellini understood that, I guess, about me, that, I do like, not eat to excess, but I savor my food.
savor, you
Yeah.
savor. This is
And,
very important.
that I could not notice everything happening everywhere around me because I'm eating chicken or whatever I was eating. It wasn't pasta, it was like roasted chicken. Um,
Marvelous. I adore
so
that.
I have seen that film. You have to look very quickly to find me.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
I've been an extra in a few films. Again, we're talking about Canadians. Norman Jewison just died,
You
and
did.
I was the opera advisor on Moonstruck. And
Were
you
you?
have to look very quickly to find me, but I pop up three times in that movie in the
Oh,
Metropolitan Opera scenes.
is that the only movie that you've been advisor on for opera? No,
No,
you're
no.
not. Okay.
Ron Howard did a documentary about Luciano Pavarotti, and I had a large advisory role in that.
Right, right.
And no, those two for opera, but I've consulted on food, on Italy, and
Mhm,
it's sort
mhm.
of a part-time job that I have if people want my knowledge. I've done a lot for French and German television about opera. So for example, when there are documentaries about Maria Callas, Renata Tebaldi, Pavarotti, Caruso, I'm often engaged to do that,
Mhm.
especially for France and Germany. Yeah,
I'm always fascinated by how opera is portrayed in film.
yeah.
It can be so frequently, for whatever reason, villains love opera. They love going to the opera. There's this whole thing of, yes, he's a brutal killer, mob boss, psychopath, but look how much he loves going to the opera of all things, or playing it while they torment someone. I'm so fascinated by
Well,
the
Glenn Close and Madame Butterfly in Fatal Attraction.
that, or Al
There are
Capone
many, many.
at the opera in Untouchables while his henchmen are doing things, or even
Or
The
Godfather
Departed.
Part Three, that
Yes.
the Al Pacino character. I don't want to spoil
Mhm.
for people who have not seen it. Something happens to this character
Yeah.
while
And
he's at the opera.
Jack Nicholson goes to the opera in The Departed with
Yeah,
two lovely escorts, and then
right.
they're snorting blow off of each other's chests. I mean, but why is it? What
And
does it
Julia
say?
Roberts, Pretty Woman,
Right. There's a non-villain
discovers.
at least.
Yeah,
Why
right.
is it so associated? Why is classical music in one of the second Sherlock Holmes movie with Robert Downey Jr.? They're torturing him to Die Forelle.
Yeah.
It's same. There was the James Bond movie that takes place at isn't the Verbier Festival? No. Anyways, the huge set of Tosca
No,
out in the
no,
water.
that's the Vienna State Opera. Oh no,
No, there was.
not James Bond. I'm sorry, Tom Cruise, Mission Impossible.
Oh, right, but as
The
we can point out, there's just so
Yeah,
many of them. And
right.
I'm wondering, like, do you have a thought as to why people find it so effortless to associate high culture with villainy or the appreciation of
because
things?
because it gives them a depth and a mystery or an exoticism or a
Mm,
kinkiness, pick your word. One of my upcoming guests is Zachary James, the bass,
mhm,
who sings a lot in opera, but he also does a lot of theater. And I recently saw him in a play called Spain, in which
mhm.
he plays a mysterious character, and the other people dismissively say about him, well, he likes opera. And, as if that's supposed to describe him, that he's
Yeah.
odd, he's weird, whatever. I don't want to give that away because I'll talk to Zachary about this. But um, No, it's that it seems outside of daily life unless it's set in Italy. There's a wonderful,
Hmm.
flawed but wonderful film called Where Angels Fear to Tread. It's sort of in the Merchant Ivory vein, and it's
Hmm.
set in Tuscany, and it stars someone like Maggie Smith or Judi Dench, even if it didn't, one of
Right.
those type of actors. And they go to see Lucia di Lammermoor in rural Tuscany
Hmm.
in, say, 1920 or 1930. And after the mad scene, the woman, the fat woman who has sung Lucia, is showered with flowers and everything. And they end the opera there. So the tenor never gets to sing his big scene that follows the
Naturally.
death of Lucia. And, to those of us who know, we laugh at the fact that the poor tenor did not get to sing her music. But for other people, it was a stereotype of passionate, emotional Italians in rural Tuscany becoming crazy over the wonderfully sung Mad Scene.
Hmm.
I mean, there's all that, and then when Wagner music like Apocalypse Now is introduced,
Hmm.
um, it it comes sometimes prepackaged with an emotion,
Hmm.
so that when you hear the Ride of the Valkyries, you're expected, or the filmmaker wants you to feel a certain emotion.
Hmm.
Um, and he or she has sort of pre-programmed that. What I loved, I knew Fellini quite well, and I got to work with him a lot, and I've taught courses on Fellini. And one of the many things I loved about him, he's my favorite film director, is that he worked with a composer, Nino Rota, the way Steven Spielberg works with John Williams, but a little differently in that Fellini would bring his drawings, his sketches of the film he was going to make to Rota, and
Hmm.
Rota would start composing before there was even dialogue. And if
Wow.
Fellini heard the music, for example, famously in La Strada, where
Hmm.
there's that trumpet solo that Gelsomina, the sad clown character, plays.
Hmm.
Um, when Nino Rota wrote that music, Fellini built the film around that music because
Didn't Kubrick as well build some of his scenes around? I remember seeing in a documentary he was playing, it was the Bartok or some of the music while he was filming scenes with the actors. He'd already chosen the music before he'd even cut the scene. He was basing it around the length of that music. If I'm maybe I'm remembering incorrectly,
and
but
was it ultimately music he used in the film or just to inspire reactions from
I think
the
it
actors?
actually it may have been both. It may have been both. I'm not enough of a scholar of Kubrick
Yeah.
to say for certain. So
Well, back to La Strada.
yeah.
I I said to Fellini that this strikes me very much as being kind of like uh, the opera Pagliacci, in
Mm,
that you have the couple who are fighting, and the man is difficult, and then there's jealousy, and ultimately he murders her. And I said it's set, sort of in the back roads of Italy in the south, and poverty and so on. And did you, Federico, were you inspired in any way by Pagliacci? He said, lying. He said, I've never seen it. And then he said, but you know that I'm a big liar. And because I'm not saying, he was one of the greatest artists ever, period. Michelangelo, Fellini, Verdi, they're up there.
mm,
And when he died, they held a state funeral for Fellini. We don't do that for our artists in North America, really, but they
mhm,
held a state funeral in the halls of government for Fellini. And he he drew from everything. He would walk around. When I say drew, I mean he absorbed, but also he drew. Tito
mhm.
Gobi, the same. Tito Gobi drew everything that he envisioned for his characters and his performances.
Really?
And because I study with Tito Gobi, and I teach at the Casa Italiana in New York, of NYU, and recently they did an exhibition of the drawings of Tito Gobi, many
Wow.
of which belong to his daughter Cecilia, who's a good friend of James Conlon, the conductor, and so therefore we made that happen. They made that happen that way. But Fellini, like Michelangelo, would envision everything on paper
Mhm.
and then give it form. In the case of Michelangelo, a sculpture, a painting, or a building. In the case of Fellini, a film. but Fellini, interestingly, always had his musician with him at the beginning. And Steven Spielberg, I know, brings in John Williams early and will cut and edit things out to accommodate the music, and it tends to
Yeah.
work very well. But yeah, so I love working in movies, but I prefer live
Yeah.
performances and speaking and so on. You and I are recording today, but I love doing live stuff because there's the urge and the energy that comes with performing live.
I
Um,
agree.
so when I was saying before that you'll go anywhere and do anything, and obviously I didn't mean anything but interesting opportunities. But I find it interesting before we talk about your opera that you're rehearsing now, that your next stop, if I got it correctly, is South Dakota to do the Brahms Requiem.
That's right.
And I didn't even know about the South Dakota Symphony, but it was founded in 1922. And it
Mhm.
looks like a very formidable musical organization and
Yeah.
makes me want to go to South Dakota now.
Yeah, and this will be my first time. I was meant to do a St. Matthew's Passion with them last year, or the year before last, and I believe I got sick right beforehand and had to cancel, unfortunately. But for me, it's my continuing collaboration with John Nelson that is the main draw, and I adore working with John. We have done. Let's see, we did a Bach Mass. We did Damnation of Faust with his orchestra in Costa Rica in concert.
Berlioz, yeah.
Yes, we of course did. We did Giovanni and Figaro at Santa Fe,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel like I'm forgetting some other things that we've done. But he's been very loyal, and he's just the dearest man to work with, and such a consummate musician, and such passion and joy in his work. So we've stayed in touch, and I continue. I cherish it. It will be my first Brahms Requiem, and I get to
I
do
was going
another
to ask you
one.
that, yeah.
Yeah, I get to do another one in the fall in Malmö, Sweden.
Sweden, okay.
Yes, so I'm excited about that. But yeah, South
Well, I'll
Dakota, my
confess
first.
that Brahms has never been my favorite composer. However, this work is one of my favorite works, period, by any composer.
Every time I've said to someone that I'm doing the Requiem, that is their response.
Yeah.
The passion that they have for this piece, the way my best friend told me that he had one of his earliest sort of musical awakenings to the power of music and what it could be and what it meant in his life, listening to the Brahms Requiem in late high school, early college. It brought him online in a different way.
And was it the music? I don't think it's the words in that one. It's in German. It's called the German Requiem, not because it's the Requiem for Germany, but because it's the German language, which
Exactly.
made a difference, say, for most requiems that are in Latin or occasionally Italian or occasionally another language. But this was in vernacular that Brahms's audiences would have understood. And I just pulled a quote from it. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And because Brahms, what we know, might have been agnostic, like Verdi, we know was either atheist or agnostic. But when Verdi used religion, it was either for a very specific purpose or to depict a character, sometimes good characters in La Forza del Destino, sometimes bad characters like in Don Carlo, sometimes hypocrites like in Traviata. But nonetheless, the emotional colors and palette of the Brahms Requiem, German Requiem, could not be more different from the Verdi, for example, just to name one.
Yeah, there's a directness to it. There's a humanity to it. Maybe that is what people are responding to is, I myself would consider myself atheist or agnostic, maybe somewhere on the Buddhist spectrum, which does not preclude the belief in something, a higher intelligence in the universe, but just not a deity. And
you don't have enough of a belly to be a Buddhist. I'm sorry.
Well, that's why I have to come. When I come to New York, we can go out eating and we can work on that. Because every time you post, I get hungry. It's just, but I was raised in a family of scientists. My father was a geologist, my grandfather an anthropologist, my great uncle was a nuclear physicist. I mean, on and on and on. And what I love and I think is missing at times in people's understanding of the humanity of humanism or sciences is how deeply passionate it can and is. And people who are immersed in it understand this full well. But seeing, my relatives and friends' eyes light up when describing some property of physics, or the when contemplating the infinite, or really cherishing the rarity and the uniqueness of humanity devoid of there being any divine intervention that caused it, realizing actually that it can feel more precious when you start to understand how statistically impossible it is that we exist at all, and that we exist a few miles below an atmosphere that would kill us, and during a brief window of time where we've stopped getting smacked by asteroids, in a brief time where it's warm enough for us to exist, and that you and me right now, that out of all the billions of people who've ever existed, that we exist at the same time, and we are here on this earth for this flash, and that we're having this conversation, that statistically this should never happen. And when that feeling gets in you, I feel like it mimics a sort of passion that religious people exhibit, can feel as well in a different way, and that there's common ground in that. And I can't speak for Brahms because I don't know what was in his head, but I feel like part of what you can respond to in that gets inside you is that passion of the human experience and of man's reaching for the divine, if not understanding it, and the mournfulness of death. And what's interesting is, as an atheist / agnostic, whatever the hell I am, one of the pieces that makes me...
the hell you are?
Woo! Good catch. One of the pieces that makes me weep uncontrollably every time is Suor Angelica.
Hello,
why?
That's my favorite Puccini opera.
Is it? Well, then look at this.
Absolutely.
And I want to hear about that. And it's strange because I went to Catholic school because they offered French immersion, but I was a non-Catholic. But what is it about not just the music, about that plot? And there's something that even within my non-belief of feeling that there is something that could offer that level of love and forgiveness, that in the moment of most despair, that there is a goodness that, it gets me every time. And I think maybe it speaks to, even within my belief system, a longing for that. All this bringing back to the Brahms, I feel like maybe some of that is in there, if we go with the theory that he was agnostic at the very least, and yet was able to compose this piece of a religious nature that captured so much and brings out so much emotion and feeling in people centuries later.
Not to take a position here on religion, because that we could debate endlessly, although I will only throw in that I think if some people understood their religions differently, we wouldn't have so many wars. That's my view. And that I don't see too many atheists starting wars. But
not over atheism. I mean, no,
not over atheism. Yeah.
Not over atheism. I know the counter argument to that is always, well, what about Stalin? And you go, I don't think his main point was trying to convert people to atheism. I think he was just a maniacal power monger who included that in their philosophy, but that wasn't the core tenet of it. Right. Whereas first page I'm not picking on this religion, but of the Quran talks about how if you're not among the believers, you are among the losers in hell. It's purely binary, with us or against us.
Well, and, we can... all religious texts, whatever, are kind of like user manuals for life. And if we fully adopt them and subscribe to them, yes, they admonish us to do good things, but sometimes they tend to exclude other people from other faiths, or women or gay people or whatever, people who are, quote, different from the, quote, normal. But that's not where I'm coming from. But what I do find fascinating among people who are not necessarily religious is that they have to find other standards.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
often those standards have to be a little more utopian in the
Mm.
absence of some faith system that takes care of things for you. You have to come to your own conclusions.
Mhm.
And that requires one, if you are a utopian, caring, egalitarian, optimistic person, to
Mhm.
look for the best in others and try to bring the best to as many people as possible rather than oppress.
Yeah, I've heard. We've all heard, if you are on this part of the belief spectrum, people asking the question: how is it possible for you to be good without God or without, the moral code that is laid down in this book? And I always find that to be a hilariously strange question, because doing it simply because I have a fear of repercussion from the divine is no reason to do good. Like, uh, yeah, it is a struggle to. Sorry, I'm now musing on so many parts of what you just said that I can't get a coherent thought out. So I'm going to let you continue.
Let me put it another way. When I teach the ring cycle, which I do kind of constantly, I've been to
Yeah.
48 complete cycles and I've led ring symposia in Salzburg and San Francisco, a lot of places, New York. Um, I always mention, without being partisan in any way, that the entire cycle is not cognizant of organized religion. So cognizant is a nice neutral word. It's not
Mm-hmm.
for or against. There are the gods, Wotan, Fricka, and that gang,
Mm-hmm.
but they also represent human beings. And
Mm-hmm.
when we go to the Wagner's Ring cycle, see Wotan's frailty, his indecision, his
Mm-hmm.
being trapped by the laws. In a way, it's like the legal system
Mm-hmm.
that are inscribed in his staff, but also that his wife Fricka insists on. Um, and how law, Brunhilde represents the triumph of reason and courage over the confinement of bad laws, in her view, bad laws. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that she takes her responsibility seriously, that I won't be fenced in by my father's, though I love him, limitations, or whoever, we know who her mother is, and her mother is the one who offers sage advice from a hole in the ground, Erda. But
Mm-hmm.
her stepmother, Fricka, is often cast as a villain. But I know many people who say, well, Fricka's right. She's upholding family values and the sanctity of marriage and all the things you say. And, so we could look at the ring and endlessly discuss the human condition. But
Yeah.
nowhere in there are the dictates of any religion.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's so fascinating because Wagner certainly wrote his Christian operas, Lohengrin, Parsifal, Tannhäuser to some degree, um, and others, and wrote operas that were not so Christian, like Meistersinger. The Flying Dutchman, I don't know what that is, but I love it. But and Rienzi is certainly not particularly religious.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and Tristan Isolde is just a meditation on human carnality, sexuality, intimacy, love, whatever, that goes outside of time. So, but the ring uniquely is just not cognizant of religion. And when it's often held up as the greatest work of art ever, not that I would say it is. Um, so let me ask you, as someone who's sung Don Giovanni in 16 different theaters, where is the religion or not in that opera?
I would say it really depends on the production to a degree. It seems to me like I've done a bunch of productions where they're trying to avoid that. There's the morality of it. But let me just deal with the first part of that. So I personally have an idea about that, if we're doing it in a slightly traditional take of it, that it is the Catholic Christian values that are, of course, what Giovanni is coming up against and tearing at. And every other character is is working under that umbrella. You know, this is the place they were raised. It's ever present. It's part of them without even thinking about it. You can lean into that as a director or not. I find it interesting to think about the path of Donna Anna being, you know, with the eternal question, how much of that first scene that takes place off stage was non-consensual or consensual. And there's a valid take where she knew exactly what she was doing. It went too far, or that it went exactly as far as she wanted to, and then he just zipped up his pants and was leaving. And her only option within the confines of that very religious society she's in is to make herself feel good in it, is to tell this story over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. And very few directors nowadays want to lean into that because it's seen as it's, you know, being a rape apologist or something. And I go, no, I mean, this is not, in today's society, a strange tale to tell, that the oppressive nature of someone's upbringing and their attitudes towards sexuality would create this situation. That's not strange. It's not even anti-feminist. Mm-hmm. The religious aspect of Don Giovanni is baked in because virtually no matter what time and place you set the production, it exists. Is Giovanni, how much Giovanni is railing against that depends on the nature of the production. Mm-hmm. And I think more very contemporary takes, it's less so. You know, we've seen the productions where it's taking place in a forest and they're drug users. I don't think they're laboring under the oppression of a highly religious society in that case. Mm-hmm. I like doing it in a variety of ways. I mean, it's the Chris Alden one, which I know you saw. Mm-hmm. Am I wrong? There was a big cross on the wall that he was. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it was there. It was looming over everything the whole time. So his whole middle finger he was throwing up was a reaction against that. And how violently he reacts against it depends on the backstory of how oppressive it was to him. Yeah.
It's an opera I've lived with my whole opera going and opera working career. I've worked on productions. I'm a very good friend of the actress and director Martha Keller, who directed a production at the Met a number of years ago, in which the previous person, I forget, frankly, if he pulled out or died, but he, at the last minute, Martha was suddenly handed the hardest opera to direct, along with Le Nozze di Figaro, right, and take existing scenery and existing costumes and make it work. And because she had no say in the scenery and costumes, she focused on the direction. Mm-hmm. And her cast included Thomas Hampson as Giovanni and Renee Papa as Leporello, and the wonderful Anya Harteros, who never sang in New York, as Donna Anna, and Christine Goerke, before she went into big girl roles, as Donna Elvira, and Hae Kyung Hong, who was a wonderful Zerlina. It was just an amazing cast. And I remember that she and I would just sit down and look at models of the scenery and talk about what happens to the characters. Mm-hmm. And she articulated something that I've heard other directors say, that it's almost never about Giovanni, but it's about the people reacting to him.
Yes.
And that sometimes it's Anna's story and sometimes it's Elvira's story. Mm-hmm. And I worked on a production years ago in which Kiri Takano was Elvira, mm-hmm, and either the director or the conductor, or maybe Kiri, though I doubt it, said it's Elvira's story. I don't think she would say that. I think she takes the direction that she's given. But nonetheless, it was so completely Elvira's story that I didn't really notice Anna. I don't even remember who Anna was. Mm-hmm. But the idea that Elvira sticks with Giovanni to the very end, and even when everyone else has abandoned him, she comes to warn him and tries to save him. Mm-hmm. We get the sense that they may have slept together more than once. Whereas Anna, it was, call it a conquest, call it consensual, whatever we call it. Part of the genius of Da Ponte is that it happens off stage, like in Greek tragedy. So the audience has to decide. But Martha Keller, I think, directed it more from an Anna point of view with Anya Harteros. And it was basically Anna's lusting after this guy, and whereas poor Elvira had to put up with stupid but wonderful Leporello.
Mhm.
Um, and Martha sort of divided the couples that way
Okay.
and focused always on the acting. And because Renee Papa and Thomas Hampson are similar heights, it was very plausible that they could exchange roles. And Renee Papa is such a good ear that he could imitate Hampson's sort of grandeur, and Hampson could be droll enough to imitate the bumpkinish aspect of it. She was
Yeah,
handed a nearly perfect cast and made the most of it.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are directorial choices that can really affect. Like, is this Elvira's story innately? No. Can it be? Sure, that's a great take. Very interesting. The curious thing about playing Giovanni is you realize you are just a reflection of everyone else. And everyone who knows Giovanni can say, yeah, there's very few opportunities where we truly get to see who he is. In the Chris Alden one, there was given this moment in the Divieni alla Finestra where he's truly alone, and you see him kind of crumbling into the despair that happens to him when he's not being stimulated or when he's alone. So it's kind of a window. But by and large, what he represents is what each of those characters wishes they had, and yet which they also feel the need to destroy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all he is. Does he even know who he is beyond his desire and beyond his adrenaline and beyond, and then for the audience, they never really get to see him. So people would say, "Oh, he was a dashing Giovanni," or I hated him," but you never actually get the chance to identify with him. You get to project onto him that which maybe you take issue with, that is unresolved in yourself. So the funny thing about Giovanni is you cannot hope that people will truly empathize with you,
Mm-hmm.
and that people will, see you. It's much like, Carmen can be like that somewhat, but everyone just projects onto you their own shit.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
Have you played Leporello?
I have once, and I may be doing another one, not confirmed yet, in the next season. I loved it. I had a great time. It was here in Montreal. It was my first one with the very fine Gordon Bintner as in his first Giovanni. And having observed, I don't know, like countless Leporellos beforehand, it was just a treat to finally just be reacting. And that is the funny thing about Leporello. This was a tricky thing for me is Giovanni drives the action at all times. He's in a scene, he has a thing he's going to do, and Leporello's going, oh God, I guess we're doing this. And it was such a different energy to be on stage and not be driving any of the action. Mm-hmm. To the point where I wasn't singing for a while, I kind of tuned out once or twice because I was so accustomed to driving the energy that my brain didn't know how to cope with just listening for it. It was very funny. And of course, the trickiness of, oh gosh, no, that isn't my line.
Yeah.
I don't, because you will go into automatic pilot and start saying, yeah, it's like when I did Count and Figaro, back to back. It was very confusing.
Every soprano or high mezzo I know who has sung Anna and Elvira has said to me without exception, I much prefer Elvira.
Oh, really? Okay.
Without exception. I could name at least 20 women who've said this to me. No one's ever said to me, I prefer Anna.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to see Elvira as the lead character.
Mm-hmm.
I no longer do. In my growth with the opera, I now see Anna as the leading female character. And so therefore my perspective on the opera has changed.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen easily 200 performances in different productions and worked on 3 productions. And I now, to me, it's Anna.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, while everything you expressed about Giovanni Leporello is true, I see Leporello as representing the working man, representing us, representing the people who are, he's, like a nice version of Loga in The Ring, or certain characters who are intermediary, Gurnemans and Parsifal, I'm getting very Wagnerite here, who are intermediaries between the audience and what's happening on the stage.
Mm-hmm.
And so Leporello to me is very simpatico as long as he's not abused.
Mm-hmm.
And you see some productions where Giovanni is just violent and brutal, and that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't make sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
To me, Giovanni delights in Leporello's admiration, his innocence,
Mm-hmm.
his willingness to just for a couple of, coins to do whatever he wants,
Mm-hmm.
his pride that his master has, slept with all these people and he has his own catalog. And,
Mm-hmm.
everything is about Giovanni's ego, but he likes him. And that's why he sort of will trade costumes with him to
Mm-hmm.
let him have a moment of seducing Elvira.
Yes,
Um,
yeah, that's very valid. If I may, you've seen, for example, Succession, the series.
I
Have you seen?
never have. I'm not a TV
Really,
guy.
it's really worth watching.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what. There's this one scene. I'm not going to give away any major plot points. So you have Logan Roy, who's the is it Logan? Yes, Logan Roy, who's the Brian Cox character, the patriarch Rupert Murdoch
Rupert
character,
Murdoch, yeah.
and they have this sort of corporate retreat, and in it, everyone wants to please Logan. They either are a child wanting his affection, his attention. All of the people around him know that if they play their cards right, they might advance, they might get more money, they might get more power. But his approval or withering disapproval is all they're living for
Mm-hmm.
because he has infinite power. And there's this scene where he, for whatever reason, he's in a state, decides to humiliate some of his son-in-law and another employee, having them on the floor, acting like dogs, barking, like eating out of dishes, like fighting each other. And everyone around gets on board cheering it because that's what Logan's doing. And the scene ends. In the very next scene, they are still slavering for his attention and approval and saying, yes, thank you, thank you, thank you, and admiring him and wishing they were like him, hating him, but can't get away from him. It's the abuse. If you've ever, I mean, I unfortunately don't have any history of abuse in my life, but the people I know who have, and when I see it, the abuse is not a deal breaker at all, and in fact can create a deeper bond. So I'm not opposed to Leporello being abused because I don't think that it cancels out his affection and love for Giovanni. It just makes it more complicated.
Yeah, but I've seen productions in which Giovanni so completely whips and abuses, like really,
Yeah,
a dog
yeah,
that wants to be there and be loyal for you, and nonetheless is subject to constant abuse.
yeah. There are ways in
That
which
to
it
me,
goes so far that
yeah.
it then ceases to be believable. I can understand that, sure.
I want to pick up on a thread that you mentioned about 15 minutes ago, that you have a family member who's a nuclear physicist.
Hmm.
You were in, I believe, the world premiere of Dr. Atomic,
Not the world
not the
premiere.
world premiere.
An interesting story about this. The nuclear physicist
Yeah.
was my great uncle. He's since passed, but he worked with Oppenheimer
Uh-huh.
on the Manhattan Project from the Berkeley laboratory. He wasn't at Los Alamos,
Yeah.
but he and Oppenheimer worked together prior to the Manhattan Project and came up, I believe, with the first model for neutron stars. And he received the Order of Canada for this, and it was George Volkoff. Brilliant man.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But no, I wasn't part of the world premiere. I was meant to cover Gerald Finley in that in San Francisco. And then once I saw the score, I went, this is unfortunately screamingly high for me. And this was, when was this? I mean, 2005?
Yeah.
6. I did not have the facility to do that role back then. So, but I did do it in San Francisco with my very good friend Ryan McKinney as Oppenheimer.
And you did Leslie Barnes.
Grove.
Grove.
Yeah.
And for people who just saw the movie, that's Matt Damon.
Yes.
Or people who saw the Met production, it's Eric Owens. I met Gerald Finley when the Met did it in New York, and we became friends. He was my guest very recently on my last show of the year of 2023, and I can send that to you because he was terrific.
Love to.
But I was hired by the Met to lead a panel and a discussion and a series about that opera when it was coming to the Met for the first time. And I had Eric Owens and Sasha Cook and Jerry Finley and Meredith Arwady, the four of them, um, helping the audience learn about this opera and how to get into it. I mean, I studied it more than most new operas, new to me operas. But what was it like doing it in New Mexico, where the famous sites were pretty close at hand?
It was fantastic. Um, so many wonderful things came out from that experience. I got to work with Julia Bullock, who is such just a wonderful artist, and Peter Sellers, of course. So there were a few things that made that very special. First of all, Peter brought in members of the community, of the local indigenous Native American community, who were at the time displaced or who were saturated with radiation in the fallout, but also a group called the Downwinders, who are still in existence, whose families and communities suffered terribly from the fallout radiation from the tests, who were never properly warned of the effects, and who have for decades, obviously, been trying to get proper government compensation for what they've gone through. So we had them on stage observing my character saying, I don't give a crap about the weather or the wind direction. This test is going to happen. And he had me directly addressing them, turning to them as they just stand in observation of this momentous time in history. And then he interrupted the show he inserted into the show a corn dance with the locals. And it was suddenly to see that this community, who were so profoundly and personally affected by it, to be bringing their culture into, and they would start the show before the opera even began. They would do it on stage. It was really, really wonderful. And then, of course, in Santa Fe, you have the weather aspect, where during at least one performance, there was one in particular, we had a full-on rainstorm coming in, with rain coming in sideways. They were squeegeeing the stage in between scenes, lightning, and my first line is I run on stage and I'm angry. I go, what the hell is wrong with the weather? And the audience just took this as, oh, thank God we can laugh, because this is insane. We're being drenched and we're not sure we're going to survive. So doing it
was
there.
that before or after they did reconstruction of part of the theater to make it a little more protected?
Well,
I worked there in '89.
This was 2008.
And boy, did we get wet.
This was 2018, I believe. Yeah. So it was, there was more protection for the audience, yes, but there's not a lot that can be done when it's coming in sideways because of gale force winds. Anyways, doing it there with such good friends and the incredible collaborative nature that Peter Sellers brings to the room was remarkable. It was very memorable. Ben Bliss, who also became a very good friend of mine, was in it. So, luxury casting across the board. And I think it was funny because my character is one sort of arietta, is him talking about his struggles with his weight. And I'm on the lean side, and so it was a little comedic to have me with no pad. I asked Peter, do you want to pad me? He goes, no. I think what's brilliant is that it shows that anyone can have body dysmorphia. You could be, if you were once heavy and are now thin, you might always see yourself that way. So that's what we're going for. I don't know how well that landed, but that was the direction you decided to go. So.
And also as a military figure, I forget if he was a general or what his status was.
Yeah.
They are very conscious about their weight, their physique, their uniform, and all of that.
Yep.
I didn't see your performance, but did he have sort of a stiff back and a tight uniform? And
yeah, it was.
Right.
It was. Everything was very neatly pressed, and he was very. Absolutely. Everything was about control with him, and he was a rat bastard apparently, but he was an incredibly effective administrator at getting things done. He was the right tool for the job.
Yep. I have a little placeholder in my head going back to South Dakota, where I've never been. Apparently there's a fantastic musical instrument museum in South Dakota. Do you know about that?
I don't.
Look it up. Apparently one of the great musical instrument museums of the world. there was a person who was a collector, and because there's nothing but room in South Dakota, he had plenty of room for them. And
Great.
I don't know if it's in Sioux Falls, but try to find out because if
Well,
you're going there, you may as well go to the Musical Instrument Museum. So now I want to talk to you about the opera that you are rehearsing now
mhm.
that I don't know. I think I know the story if I know my Greta Garbo movies. Am I on the right
Mhm.
track?
Uh,
Um,
yeah, that was an early version of it. Yeah,
okay. So it's called La Reine Garçon, which sort of means the boy queen.
Boy Queen. Hmm.
Yeah. But it's not what it sounds like from what I could tell from the title. But there are no countertenors, right?
They're not.
Okay. Um, but it's about Queen Christina or Christine of Sweden,
Hmm.
who, as played by Greta Garbo, was famously androgynous and didn't seem to have an interest in men, but she was the ruler. And then there's Carl Gustav and a countess, and then you play Chancellor Lord Oxenstierna.
Axel Oxenstierna. That's right.
Axel Oxenstierna, and someone did not turn off his phone. Okay. Um, I
I would point you also
apologize.
towards a version. So this was a screenplay which was
Hmm.
turned into a film called La Reine Garçon,
Yeah.
in English, or the girl queen, or the boy queen.
Hmm.
God, the boy queen.
Yeah.
Um, and by Marc Bouchard, Québécois playwright. And before it became the film, he turned the screenplay into a play, which was performed at the Stratford Festival and here in Quebec to great acclaim.
For people who don't know, Stratford is a great theater festival in Canada.
Terrific,
Not
terrific.
not the other Stratford, but
Right. And so then he had already collaborated with Julien Bilodeau for La Beauté du Monde, and they decided to turn this very well-known, loved play into an opera. And so a better take on the direction that the plot in this goes would be found in the film version of it. Um, Queen Christine of Sweden was a, I guess for her time, a progressive. She wanted to turn Sweden into an intellectual, cultural, scientific, educational mecca. And she sought peace above all in a time where, of course, the Catholics and the Protestants were at continual war, and warring factions in the region were rife. And she was willing to bankrupt the entire uh, kingdom basically to achieve this. And also, she purportedly had relationships with women she didn't want to marry. She was very in and out of her time. And in the end, she abdicated her throne rather than submit to the requirements of her reign, if you will, of her position. There were enticements from the Catholic Church, from the Pope himself, to, if you convert to Catholicism, we will allow you to live however you want publicly, including intimate matters. Anyway, so this is her story, and I play her chancellor and advisor, who is trying to get his son to perhaps be the next king, but also trying to preserve Sweden and their autonomy by resisting the papacy.
so I understand that the play was written in the province of Quebec, but it's interesting to me that a story that's clearly not Canada related, not that it has to be, but there
Mm-hmm.
it's about royalty when, I know that the British monarch is still on your money, but
Mm-hmm.
Canada is not the biggest royalist country in the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very much a big democracy. It's very much more accepting of integration and immigration than even the United States and other countries. And where is the point of interest in this story for the people in Canada who will be seeing it and then perhaps elsewhere?
I think, well, look, there's no end of interest still in what monarchs do. look at, or the very rich. Everything from Bridgerton to, Pride and Prejudice to The Crown. We cannot help but be fascinated by what people in power, or even Succession for that matter. That's royalty of a kind. Honestly, if you talk about power and money, I always lament that a little bit, just how endlessly fascinated we are with what rich people are doing. Like, it's just,
I beg to differ.
really.
I I just I don't use this language, but if I did, I would just tell them where they could go.
Mm,
Because, I've known exceedingly wealthy people who are kind and generous and do wonderful things and do great things with their money. But I've also encountered those who are abusive and horrible and, structure tax systems so that people
mhm,
are starving and don't have medical attention or are living, five people in one room
mhm,
while they live in apartments or homes that have 20 rooms for two people and who are very self-serving and feel entitled. And I the word that I most apply to myself is egalitarian, and I've
mhm,
been that before I knew the definition of the word. I've just innately been that
mhm,
resources are here for all of us and they need to be shared, not abused, not wasted. But how dare anyone feel entitled? I, in my job at the Metropolitan Opera, had to deal with people like Indira Gandhi and Henry Kissinger and Nancy Reagan, who I liked, actually. I liked Nancy Reagan. Um, and all kinds of people. And some of them were great, some of them were really awful, Henry Kissinger being the worst,
mhm,
who just felt that everything had to be handed to them. Same with opera singers, for that matter.
mhm,
I've worked with the greatest stars in opera, and a
mhm,
lot of the greatest stars in opera were the most wonderful people. Joan Sutherland, Marilyn Horne, Luciano Pavarotti, a number of others. Um, and sometimes others were not. And I'm not saying that they're supposed to be great, but I always felt that when I was performance manager at the Met, that my goal was to run the ethical grand opera.
mhm.
And then someone said, well, the acronym for that is EGO. And I said, okay, we have to rename our opera company.
Ah.
but
Well, hold on. So, what is your what?
but the thing is, I really, they seem to be demanding our attention.
Sure. Look, I don't disagree with a single thing you've said. My point isn't that they deserve attention. I'm saying that I'm amazed at how much society still wants to give them attention.
Right. But you were using the word we.
Well, we is
And I
not
didn't think you
not
meant
this
you and
we.
me, but
Sorry,
I thought you were part of the we. I'm
the
not.
we is yeah. No, the societal we has an endless appetite for housewives of New Jersey, like this Kardashian royalty narratives, blah blah, on and on.
Not
And
me.
even, and I will say this, look, even in how famous opera singers, or even not like trying to be famous opera singers, present themselves on social media, what are they coding? Wealth. Look at me in my gown. Look at this fabulous hotel I'm in. Look at this. Look, I'm traveling again. The glossiness of it. If you go into looking at these profiles from today forward, going, what are they coding? It's wealth. That's
Yeah,
it.
I
Yeah.
know.
And so why is that? Because there's still an endless appetite for the fascination with class and wealth. And so getting back to the original question about why is this opera being written, I go, it doesn't strike me as particularly strange. The monarchy story of that I had personally never heard of prior to doing this being presented in North America, I go, well, it's a little strange, but monarchy stories are, we love them. No, we we love them. And this one is interesting because I think it's leaning into exploring how gender and power and how that was dealt with, and her explorations of how to be true to herself and also still honor her responsibilities and her larger principled wishes versus the reality of politics. I think these are all things that are being explored, and I think those are largely understandable narratives. I think these stories can also be told by non-rich people. I'm not condemning that this one is. I think that it's an interesting Yeah, it's an interesting perspective. Any of these stories, you have to have a thematic perspective and go, I'm not going to focus on the politics. I'm focusing on her exploration of intimacy and identity. And that's a very ripe subject these days, of course, is intimacy, identity, gender norms. So I think that's the position they're taking on this. Could have easily gone a different direction.
Yeah. I want to remind listeners the opera is called La Reine Garçon, and you're going to be hearing us after the run has been completed, February 3rd, 6th, 8th, and 11th. Do you happen to know if it's being recorded on video in any way?
I don't know if it's being recorded on video. However, the Canadian Opera Company is a co-producer, and they're going to be producing it in 2025.
In Toronto.
In Toronto.
And you actually pronounce it the way I do, Toronto, but not the way you Canadian.
Instead of Toronto? I was raised in the West. I never even knew that. I didn't know that.
So where did you grow up in Canada?
I grew up in Calgary. I was born in Ottawa, but we moved to Calgary when I was 3.5. And I was there.
I should know this. Is that Alberta?
It is Alberta.
Okay.
It's also known as the Texas of Canada.
I know that. Talk about, I mean, I've been to much of Canada, but I've not been to Alberta.
Yeah. Calgary Exhibition and Stampede, lots of country western, cattle town, gas town. But it was a really wonderful place for me to grow up. As I've been asked about it before, and was really wonderful is within the classical music community, I started taking lessons when I was very young. If you showed an interest, there was a strong community of well-trained musicians who would claim you and support you. And it was a small enough community that you could get individual attention. So I was kind of plucked out of an annual competition, the Kiwanis Music Festival, and Calgary Opera saw me and then cast me as Amal in Amal Not Like Visitors and one of the three boys in the Magic Flute. And then I continued doing musical theater and show choir. I got with a teacher who kept nudging me towards opera. But at all times, there were enough people that you could have a community, and they'd been trained at good schools worldwide. And just to encourage and train you. Whereas I think in a lot of, larger cities, you would just never get that opportunity because it's just the pool is too big or it's too diffused. So I left, I did 2 years at a community college there and then went to the Oberlin Conservatory of Music for my bachelor's and master's.
Ohio in the United States, yep.
Yes. And then on to the Cincinnati Conservatory for my artist diploma.
Which I know very well.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in America, maybe Canada too, but not the rest of the world, there is a series of jokes called the light bulb jokes, as in how many does it take to screw in a light bulb?
Right.
And some of them are naughty and rude, and others are about the stereotypical things about the people we're describing. But my favorite one is actually about students at Oberlin.
Oh, gosh.
How many OBs does it take to screw in a light bulb?
I don't know. How many?
1 to screw in a light bulb, the other 2 to do an interpretive dance.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's good. That's a lot tamer than I was expecting. That's true. Oberlin is so funny, has become a shorthand for a variety of things. I mean, I use it as a shorthand whenever I'm talking about sort of, is anything going to weird me out? No, I went to Oberlin. Are you kidding? And, it's this hotbed of sort of progressivism and liberal, true liberal arts college in the middle of conservative Ohio. And what I was just talking with a friend of mine, we're so grateful that we were there prior to social media. Mm-hmm. Because now, I mean, I know that there are, bad actors who will basically mine and the accounts of Oberlin students to find the most recent bad hot take that we all had in college. We all were trying out new ideas and feeling passionate about something and saying something stupid. But thank God it wasn't on social media. Yeah. But now it all is. And then it gets pulled to go, aha, evidence of liberalism gone amok. I go, well, yeah, of course. Thank God no one quoted me. But I was in a safe place to work out my ideas, not in the public sphere. Boy, I lament that being taken away. Because Oberlin was a place where the weird kids got together to try out their ideas. And I loved being there for that because everything I believed was challenged, but we were in a bubble where we didn't have to worry about the judgment from the outside world. We were just all there finding out who we were. I loved being there. It was great.
So you raised two things I could address, but I do want to ask you, I know that you're in rehearsal and we have 90 minutes and we're at like 87 minutes right now. Tell me where you stand time-wise.
I'm fine. I'm good.
You want to go on a little longer?
Let's do it.
Okay. The first thing is conservative Ohio, as you describe it. Ohio to me is a very perplexing state, and I mean that in the best way, because um, when I was growing up, there was a political writer for the New York Times named R.W. Apple, Bobby Apple, and he would cover elections like no one else. He had his own style, and it was a bit pompous, but nonetheless, he would sort of do a snapshot of every state. And I think he might have been from Ohio, I'm not certain. But Ohio was always the bellwether, and Columbus, Ohio, the capital, was
Mm-hmm.
viewed as the city in America that gave you the best read on where Americans stood
Mm-hmm.
on, on soap, on politics, on anything.
Mm-hmm.
Ohio State, its football team, the Ohio State University, is considered a big powerhouse. And in many ways, Ohio is exemplary. They have Cincinnati Opera and Conservatory is a wonderful institution. Cleveland Orchestra is often called the best orchestra in the United States. Severance Hall there is magnificent. There are
Mm-hmm.
great art museums in Ohio. Ohio, in its small cities, has wonderful opera companies.
Mm-hmm.
That most states don't have that many small opera companies that thrive and have support.
Mm-hmm.
Cincinnati, where I've worked a lot in full disclosure, is a city that was born of German immigration largely, plus a very large Jewish presence, plus a very large African American presence, because it's at the Ohio River. And enslaved people were able to cross the river, wound up being free in Ohio. So there's a museum of slavery, I think it's called, in Cincinnati. The opera Margaret Garner. Toni Morrison was from Ohio and wrote about the experience of enslaved and non-enslaved Black people sort of at the edge of the South and the proximity of overt racism as opposed to the presence of covert racism.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's not easy to describe that state.
I
And
agree.
I try to give it the benefit of the doubt. It has in recent years, in terms of voting, skewed toward the Trumps of the world, but it goes much beyond that. It has certain weirdnesses, as every state does. It has one of the highest levels of opioid abuse in the United States. But it also had Kent State University, which is famous for
Mm-hmm.
the anti-war demonstrations where Nixon ordered the killing of students. Well, all right, let me rephrase that. Where Nixon would have been cognizant of the fact that students were killed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's such a diverse state. Youngstown, Northeast is sort of steel mill and very industrial and Italian and Black, and Dean Martin was from there, and lots of Italian Americans, and the Slavic peoples of Cleveland, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It's just in the football, the Hall of Fame is in Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very particular. When I go there, my senses, my alertnesses are always heightened by the fact that I don't want to stereotype Ohio,
Mm-hmm.
even though I think it's fair for you to say conservative Ohio right
I
now.
should have said conservative. The area that Oberlin is in
Yeah.
is a rural part of Ohio that is itself conservative. But you're totally correct. It would be inaccurate of me to paint with large brush like conservative Ohio. It has shifted that way through, in the last, I've been out of college for 25 years now. So it has shifted less. It's less of a purple state and feeling more solidly red. Gerrymandering has had a good hand in that, and some exceptional propagandizing through social media. Very effective.
But you
Terrifyingly.
can have it. I'm not getting too political, but I'm suddenly forgetting his name. But the senator from Ohio,
Jared
who's
Brown.
running, yeah, Sherrod Brown is running for election this year, and the former mayor of Cleveland are at one end of the spectrum. But then you have the Jim Jordans and those people, and
J.D. Vance and all those.
yeah,
Yeah.
it goes all across the spectrum there. It's not like a state like California, New York, which tends to have one flavor, or Wyoming, or
Mhm.
these states that have Missouri
There's
that
very
have
little
another
room
flavor.
for anyone to succeed in politics. I think particularly, well, I don't know. Anything I say, I'm going to come up with an exception, but it is hard for someone who wants to talk about nuance to get ahead. You're rewarded in the media and on social media for hard moral stances that are black and white and are absolutist. And
Yeah.
by appealing directly to the outrage and by activating people that way, you're rewarded for that. So there's no incentive to have nuanced talks about things. It's just not, the algorithm itself doesn't reward it. So,
And that was actually the larger point that you were making that I wanted to get to,
unfortunately,
that people who could experiment with their ideas and
mhm,
work through their ideas. I went to journalism school at Columbia University, which is about, accuracy and reporting, but also about not taking as gospel or as verbatim everything that's told to you, and
right.
that you're required to be investigative, and you should never seek confirmation of what you've already assumed the story to be. Even
Mhm,
something as simple as there was a fire and the fire started because of electricity. Well, maybe it didn't. Maybe it
right,
started because someone was smoking. And
right.
if you have that mindset when you go to journalism school or are a practicing journalist or a scientist who is not looking for his or her assumption to be confirmed, but is
Mhm,
willing to see whatever presents in the test tube. Um, and I think that is something that we're losing, not just in the United States, but in our world. Um, that, show me,
mhm.
give me evidence.
It's so fascinating because on one hand, yes, absolutely. Look, there's fantastic ways to activate people because we're very image related. So if you have a post, be it about, let's say, our present conflict in Israel Palestine, whatever side one comes down, you show an image of bodies with text telling you what it is. The activation of your reptile brain towards that short circuits your even desire to look deeper. And so both sides are going to be using these tactics to try to capture your attention, get you activated to the point where you've had the emotional reaction and the belief is cemented, right? But what's interesting is on the flip side of that, where there's less of a desire, as you said, for show me, is also this strong belief that I'm going to do my own research.
Hmm.
And we saw that during COVID. Well, just do your own research, buddy. It's like, okay. But the problem is, how trained are you in how to research? How good are you at getting past your biases? Because most of us are not. We all believe that we're the exception, that our biases are not going to dictate which sources we believe to be more true than that one. But we are simply more likely to believe the ones that are either have established trust or confirm what we already believe. But we all think we're the exception to that. And you and I, of course, are, but everyone else is.
um, but and this is why, and I'm not being facile here, but I really mean it. This is why the likes of us, and I hope other people, turn to art,
Hmm.
because what artists and creative artists, not just visual artists, love them though I do, but people creating live art or literature, um, tend to bring their own whatever they've absorbed within them. I mentioned Toni Morrison before. Her
Mm-hmm.
books are towering, not just because she was a great writer, but because of her willingness to address tough human issues humanely, but without being polite, so to speak. I mean, emotionally polite.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, the environment in which you absorb art allows you to, examine nuances and more perspectives. But let me ask you this, and I know we're going to get over time on this, but there seems to me like a lot of art being produced nowadays, and I'll even just go in opera, and I'm going to use this word carefully and qualify it so that no one's going to jump on me, but a lot of it is propaganda. And by propaganda, I mean, I'm trying to make you believe a particular thing. and there is an ideology informing the art. Whereas, and that's like, I can agree with it. I might go, yeah, I absolutely believe that. We are aligned, but it's still propaganda. Whereas I think the art that I want is not trying to convince me of something or trying to make me believe something, and isn't ideologically based. It might have a story, but it allows you to form your own opinions. And increasingly, I see that the pieces that are getting the funding, being produced, typically are either borderline or, to me, fully propaganda. Even when I agree with
propaganda,
the
you
best.
mean for a social movement or not a political movement?
Could be. It could be both.
Yeah.
I mean, oftentimes they're so intertwined. How do you separate them? But, and again, just because I agree with it doesn't make it any less propaganda. And I'm a little frustrated by that because I want good stories and I want good perspectives, but I don't want all art to be towards a political end. I know the quote is all art is political, but that's in the
No, I
interpretation.
don't think it is.
Well, yeah,
I
well,
think all art is human.
it can be, but it's not necessarily political in intention.
Right.
All art is political because everything that is being absorbed and affecting your brains can be applied politically, but there's a difference between that and making a piece of art towards a political or social end. And that's where I think we're losing the thread. Is those are the ones that are being promoted, funded, and produced, to the exception of others. And I don't always want that. I think I'm not alone in that, but that's a very tricky thing to bring up, because when a piece is being produced that is speaking to a larger social movement, you are not empowered to say, boy, I wish that this wasn't so propaganda. I wish that, that's a surefire way to get slapped down. Even when I agree with it.
I would say for opera at least that often what happens is we can have an existing work.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take Boris Godunov,
Mm-hmm.
which obviously would be considered a political opera because it's about a political figure, or Verdi's Simone Boccanegra, which is similar in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
But these are also family stories.
Mm-hmm.
And if I were staging, I did once Simone Boccanegra, I stage it as a family story with a political background,
Right.
but it's about a family.
Mm-hmm.
I've never staged Boris Godunov. I would love to, but that to me is a family story with mental illness at the center of it.
Right.
And
Right.
it just happens that he's the leader of an empire.
Exactly. Like that is it's in there. It's already in.
Boris Godunov, the opera could be staged as a political thing about,
Sure. And it is, I was at the Bolshoi a couple of years ago, and I saw their 1950 something production of Boris Godunov. Magnificent. I mean, big old sets. It's like it's like the Zeffirelli ones, but at the Bolshoi.
Yeah.
And it is, it was produced at that time as a means towards state propaganda, in the sense that it was the power of the Russian Empire, and we're putting this on to promote Russian culture. But that's the purposes behind the production were separate than the purposes behind the composition.
Mm-hmm.
And the inherent story, which is still just a family story.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm talking about. Yes, you could take anything and make it a piece of propaganda, depending on how you do it. But I'm talking about the creation of the work itself. Increasingly, I see pieces being created and funded and promoted that I think from their inception were designed towards let me show this ideology, let me show this, and try to sway you about its merits. And
in the United States as well?
Well, I'm talking I think more in the United States.
I ask because a lot of times funders want to sidestep anything controversial completely. You may find individual places. I mean, Dr. Atomic is now not a brand new opera. But you were in an opera I haven't seen yet that I very much want to see, called Omar. Is that correct?
Yeah, I've done it.
By Rhiannon Giddens.
I've done four times now. And Rhiannon and she wrote the role for me.
Yeah.
We've known each other for 25 years now, from Oberlin days. Yeah.
Oh, she's an Obi. So for people who don't know, Rhiannon Giddens hosts a podcast called Aria Code that I've been on a few times. and it's worth looking up. Look, ARIA code, not area code, but ARIA code. Do you know it?
Of course, yeah.
Okay.
We've spoken about it many times.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so she hosts that, and it's a wonderful program for people who may not know opera or want to learn a lot more about it.
Mhm.
Um, and so, yeah, so that is an opera I don't know. Is it political? I know a little about it, but not enough to speak authoritatively.
Yes, it is. It has political elements. Is it designed to further a political end? I don't believe so. It has a perspective. It speaks about a highly politicized subject, obviously, slavery, equality, the clash of cultures and colonialism. I think what Rhiannon does is she focuses on the journey of this man, though, and his, so it's not saying at the end, you must feel this particular way about this issue.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it is his autobiography brought to life. And yeah, so I think there are social issues contained in it. She has a very unique perspective, and that she wanted to bring out about the an educated Muslim man who was brought into kidnapped into slavery, and how this story is told differs from how other slave narratives have been told.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, no, I don't. But it is political. But is it a piece of political propaganda? It'd be a stretch to call it that. Yeah.
I just think that, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but I want to avoid that a little bit because I think it's a lot more diverse. And that there are times when, yes, there's propaganda is overt, and where whatever social or political or religious or other movement people adhere to and want to promote, that they may create works of art, not just opera, that advocate for that. But then I
Absolutely.
also advocate, maybe is the word, but I also find many wonderful works of contemporary opera and art that are just about people
Mm-hmm.
and allow us, the audience members, to insert ourselves into the lives of these people.
I totally agree. I totally agree. Even Dead Man Walking, which I've done 3 times now. What I admire about that is it about a political issue? Absolutely. A social issue? Completely. Do some of the characters have very strong opinions against capital punishment? Absolutely. Can you leave that show and still be pro capital punishment? 100%.
I would invite listeners to go back and look up my conversation with Jake Hagee, the composer of the opera, because he so beautifully addresses that in our conversation about that it was never about promoting a cause.
Mm-hmm.
It was about exploring the aspects of the issue, also from the point of view of the families of the people who were murdered.
Exactly.
And their rights and their feelings as much as the person who's been condemned to death on death row.
Yeah, which was funny to me when there was a mild kerfuffle over that. There's some who were claiming that it was not giving a voice to the victims. This is when the Met one happened, and some people were and I went, "Have you even seen the show? Like this is so absurd. Of course they're having a voice. Anyone who was saying that has not seen the show." Jake was. And of course, I love Jake. We've collaborated now a few times, and that was entirely his intention, was to allow you to have your own experience and make up your own mind about it. And I know people who said, I think about it differently now, but I'm still very pro capital punishment at the end of it. That's fine.
The governor of New York in these days is facing a question that there was a massacre in Buffalo, and while her feelings may be personally against capital punishment, I think that she's open to the feelings of the relatives of the 10 people who were killed.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I would feel the same way. Don't get me wrong, but I don't want my vengeful feelings to be the dictating part of how justice is meted out in a civil society, personally.
And that's the whole story of La Clemenza di Tito. Have you ever been in that opera?
No, I haven't.
Leo?
I haven't.
It's Mozart's best opera.
You think so? Okay. I'll be totally honest. I have not had the opportunity to see a production in the flesh. So
you're kidding.
This is often the case. So, as a performer, if I'm traveling to a city, I'm typically the only show in town.
Hmm.
I lived in New York for a time, and I've been doing gigs in various cities where perhaps the opera company is doing more than one show at that time. But by and large, the cognoscenti and the fans like yourself are always one of my relatives is a Wagner fanatic, opera fanatic, travels the world to see things, and is always saying, "Oh, have you seen this?" I go, "I have never even listened to it." And it's shocking how you can go your whole career and miss out on seeing so many of these productions live simply because you're busy doing it.
So at the beginning of our conversation, I'm looking for my note. I described you as Daniel Okulitch, bass baritone, seems to go anywhere there is an interesting opportunity. I'm redefining that. Daniel Okulitch, the only show in town.
I'll take it.
And Daniel, with that, I'm concluding. I thank you for this wonderful, illuminating conversation. I think it helped people to understand how artists were, at least you, but also many others that I've known, how you tick, what makes you tick, and how you approach everything inherent in the works that you're asked to undertake, whether they are classics like the Brahms Requiem or Don Giovanni, or brand new works that you're working on in these days. So, everyone, you have a website, I imagine,
I do.
Okulitch, Daniel Okulitch.com.
That is it.
Okay. So wherever you live in the world, Daniel is coming to your town eventually.
I hope
And
so.
he's a wonderful performer and singer in addition to a very thoughtful artist. And I thank you.
Thank you, Fred. This was a joy. Thank you.